hopefully, as I'm talking through this chapter, there's going to be an accumulation of the information that I've already been giving you. Remember, we started by talking about your own self-awareness, that as you become more aware, you're able to manage yourself better, with a view toward becoming a much better defined person. I've found over and over again that people, as they grow up, become very misaligned often internally, don't realize the internal competing values. We're going to talk about that some more in a subsequent lecture. And as a result, as they become misaligned internally, they start losing trust with the people around them, because the people around them very quickly begin to pick up the fact that they say one thing and do another. And we talked about, if you remember, your bent in life, your intentional difference, those things that are uniquely you, that you're born with, and yet, unfortunately, parents and society and whatnot often move us further away from that. And the further we are away from our bent, often the more misaligned we become internally. All that said, now, as we come to the area of conflict, I think, is probably the most important area for understanding yourself. And as I'm going to be teaching you about conflict, and as I want you to understand it with the people that you're coaching, I want you to realize that conflict, and as we get into conflict, it will tell you much, much more about yourself than it ever will about anybody else. Now, that is very counterintuitive to the way this is actually taught, because most of the literature that I've read on conflict, and I've read quite a bit of it and heard people talk about it, it's usually about managing the relationship or managing the other person. The way I'm going to talk to you about it is solely about managing yourself, understanding yourself and managing yourself, becoming, if you will, the non-anxious presence in the midst of conflict, which will, in many ways, be able to bring the conflict focus, first of all, to a much better place, and then to a resolution that makes sense. But in the slides, and I think it's in the manual also, there's a questionnaire there that you may want to take just a minute to look at and take if you want. There's 9 questions there. Conflict and confrontation are the same thing, is the first question. And most people, and myself included, would say no, that's not really true. Confrontation is maybe one particular aspect of conflict, but no, that is not the case. Second question, conflict in teams is good. A lot of people think that would say false on that. But do you know that the highest functioning teams in any organization in the country are the most conflicted? And by the way, the worst functioning teams in any organization are the most conflicted. The issue is not conflict, in other words. The issue is the focus of conflict and how it's actually managed that determines whether or not an organization is good or bad. But conflict itself is very, very important in teams. Third question there, lack of conflict in teams indicates high team cohesion. I think not. In fact, what you tend to find, if you have no conflict in a team, what you probably have is groupthink. And for those of you who know much about world history, you will know that groupthink, where an entire group is constantly nodding yes to whatever the leader says, are the kind of situations that get us and have gotten us in world history into trouble over and over again. Because the thing that conflict does is as people disagree about any particular issue, it tends to ripen the discussion. In other words, if you have a team of 6 people and a leader, and all 5 are agreeing with the leader over and over again, you have 5 people that are unnecessary. They're not adding anything to the discussion except nodding their heads. What the other 5 should bring to the discussion is disagreement. That's fine. That's okay. In fact, not only is it fine and okay, it's essential if you want to ripen the discussion and arrive at a decision that makes sense. Unfortunately, many people run the other way when conflict starts to develop, for various reasons. A lot of it has to do with their upbringing and whatnot, and how conflict was mishandled in their own personal story. But unfortunately, when they do that, when they dampen conflict, when they discourage conflict, especially if they're the leader in doing that, what they're in fact doing, as far as I'm concerned, is flattening out the conversation, making it unidimensional, and making all the other people in the room unnecessary. So conflict is the kind of thing, and you can go through the rest of these questions here. They become a little more obvious now that I've answered the first three of them as to whether it indicates poor leadership. In fact, I think absence of conflict represents poor leadership. If you have a leader who says, my staff never conflicts with me, I'll show you a poor leader. And I'll show you a situation that has groupthink, and I'll show you a situation that they get themselves over and over again into situations that are bad for them because the people at the table are not allowed to disagree with the leader. But unfortunately in our society, a lot of leaders are intimidated by conflict. They will squelch it. And going back to our communication that we did in the last chat that we had together, remember, I may say to you that I invite your disagreement, but I may in fact act towards you a totally different way when you do disagree. By chastising you, casting you aside, marginalizing you, whatever. So I'm saying one thing and doing another. Of course, you won't trust me in that kind of a situation, and the conflict is going to be completely squelched in such a situation. Well, let's look at the nature of conflict. And by the way, I've said this to many, many ministers, and I'm going to say it right now, and that is, ministry does not involve conflict. Ministry is conflict. And if you're in ministry for more than 15 minutes, I guarantee you're going to be in conflict. In fact, if you follow Jesus through the Gospels, it's very hard to find any situation that he wasn't in conflict. Why is that? It's because he's coming against an entire world order, and what he is presenting is always in conflict with that world order and in conflict with the people that he's facing. So ministry is conflict. If you're escaping it, or if you're in a situation where you say to me, I've been in ministry for 20 years and I've never really had significant conflict with parishioners or with vestry or board members, I would think that what you are doing then is you probably have a double PhD in conflict avoidance, and that you figured out who to agree with and how to dance and maneuver around it to such an extent that possibly your ministry has been compromised as a result. But let's look at the nature of conflict. We tend to, in my consulting world, we tend to look at conflict in two different ways, and this is the way I want you to understand it. And this is what makes conflict either extremely valuable to you or extremely dangerous to you. I would put it as a metaphor very similar to fire. Fire is a wonderful thing. It cooks your food, it heats your house. It's a very dangerous thing. It burns your house down, it creates forest fires, it can do all kinds of bad things. Fire itself, though, is neutral, if you will. Contained, it's utilized in very effective ways. Uncontained, it becomes very, very dangerous. Conflict is very, very similar. And we have divided conflict into two different ways of looking at it. We call it the red zone and the blue zone. And let's walk through this and let's figure out then, when we're talking about conflict in these two different ways, let's see if we can figure out exactly what we're saying as to how conflict actually unfolds for people. This is very, very important to understand. First of all, let's talk about the red zone. Red zone conflict is conflict that is about self. It's conflict that involves my personal story. It's conflict that reaches down inside of my brain and brings up my story, and my story then becomes the focus of the conflict. Now, here's what makes that statement I just made very, very difficult for most people to grasp. It would be fine if there was markers to this. My wife is an oncology nurse. Certain cancers that you will get have very clear markers to them so that there's symptoms that will alert you very quickly. But my wife works in the area of female cancers where so many of those don't have markers. In fact, the markers only appear after it's spread, and the spread of it then usually creates markers because it's into other organs. That's very, very dangerous, obviously, you can imagine, because all cancer, as you probably know, you need to capture cancer very, very quickly, and the quicker you get it, the more easily eradicated it becomes. The more it's able to spread, the more dangerous it becomes. Red zone is very similar to the unmarkered conflict. In other words, as you are in conflict with another person, and as that conflict begins to unfold, and let's say the conflict began, let's say you're at a vestry meeting, and you're having conflict as to resource allocation. I mean, that happens over and over again, in not just in vestries, but in any nonprofit, in any organization. It can be profit, nonprofit. It happens in the government all the time. Where do we allocate resources? They're finite. Everywhere they're finite. There's no such thing as infinite resource. So you have finite resources, which means you have to prioritize where those resources are going to be allocated. Now, that sets up always a situation for conflict, because people have differing priorities as to where the resources should be allocated. So you're sitting in the vestry, and somebody there who is very passionate about youth ministry really, really wants more resource allocated toward the youth to get a first class, maybe to get beginning with a first class staff member who can head a youth initiative because our church is located right next to the high school, blah, 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 kind of thing. Somebody else on the vestry says, no, 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 no. We really need to, because we live in a warmer climate and more people are retiring down here. Plus they are all, by the way, the deep pocket givers. We need to allocate more resources to that population. Okay, that sets up conflict now. Should we give it to the youth? Should we give it to the retirees? Kind of thing. It's a perfectly fine conversation, actually. It's one that, this is where we can talk about competing values. And competing values, when we talk about it, and I'll talk about it more later, but it's not a good value trumped by a bad value. It's a good value trumped by another good value. That's what makes it complicated. In other words, if I thought, okay, when I leave here today, should I go home directly or should I rob a 7-Eleven? That's not a competing value. I mean, I know the answer to that. But should I go to my small group, or should I go to my child's soccer game? Now that's a competing value, because both of those are very, very important. So how do I prioritize those? Anyway, that brings in internal conflict, and we'll talk about that later. But it also, within a group, conflict develops as people have these competing values, and they'll place them on the table. We need to have more resources to the youth. We need to have more resources to the retirees. Fine, okay. Let's have a conflict about that. Let's talk about that. Let's try to make sense about it. Let's look at the demographics of our community here. Let's talk about church growth. Let's talk about what the Holy Spirit is saying to us. Let's talk about now all kinds of different ways of looking at that problem are brought to bear. All of that is great, and that's exactly where conflict is best used. Here's the problem. Let's say, because I told you how old I am, so let's say that I'm one of those who really wants more resources allocated to people who are in excess of 60 years old. Okay, and that I am very, very fervent about that, and I'm really, really starting to dig my heels in about that. And the people on the vestry, and I'm noticing that there's more people on the vestry who are making more sense of allocation to the youth than they are to the older folks, that it's starting to swing against me. Here's what red zone conflict involves. All of a sudden now, I'll start defaulting into my own story. It's actually a brain, I won't give you a lot of brain research here, but it actually is a brain event. There's a switching station inside your brain called the amygdala, which sends signals either to the adult parts of your brain, the frontal lobes, where you can think about things logically, or it sends it more to the emotional sides, the back of our brain. We talked about that when we were talking about trust. The place where I think your story is kept. Now, if the signal goes back to the back of my brain, a good chance is it'll start then activating those parts of my story that, first of all, have never been brought to the light of day, but are very, very energized for me. It starts creating anxiety for me, and I'm going to explain some of those, the particular themes that anxiety could take. But now, all of a sudden, the issue, and this is where I'm saying that there's no real clear markers as to how this actually works inside of a person, to allow you to realize that it's happening. But now, all of a sudden, there's a subtle shift starting to take place. I, in other words, am no longer talking about resource allocation as I'm sitting on that vestry meeting. I'm now talking about Jim Osterhaus. That's now the topic for me. But I'm not aware of it because everybody is still talking about resource allocation, as am I. So on the face of it, it looks like there's no red zone symptoms here. But what has happened now, it has become very, very personalized for me. Red zone conflict is personalized conflict. It's conflict that reaches down into my person and brings up my personal issues. And I'm going to talk about the 4 issues that I think that are prominent here. As opposed, though, before I do that, though, let's talk about the blue zone. Blue zone conflict, which is different, has to do with the mission of the organization. In other words, the conflict focuses on the mission. So, resource allocation is a great mission topic. It's a topic that is constantly discussed in any organization. It has to be discussed, again, because there's finite resources. The resources can be allocated in different ways depending on how the organization prioritizes going forward. And they prioritize going forward, by the way, according to the vision. That's why people do strategic planning. They decide, first of all, what is our mission? Okay, once we establish what our mission is, then we decide where are we going. That's our vision. Where are we going in the next 2 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years? Okay, and then after that we start talking about strategy. Okay, we decided that we're going in this direction. How are we going to get there? Which then determines how do we allocate our resources to get us there. So let's say that in this church situation that I've been talking about with the youth and the older people, that they have done a strategic plan and they've decided that the demographics and strategic planning within a church context is often done and most successfully done when there's a demographic study within the organization. So they are now looking at the demographics of the community that they're in, and they've decided that house prices are elevating, which means younger families cannot afford to be there, which means that the population is going to age. So now they're thinking our ministry, either we move the church or our ministry is probably going to become more and more gray-haired. What does that mean to us as a congregation, and what does that mean in relation to our vision going forward?